Hey guys, and welcome back to a new episode of Mobile Dev News. That is the format in which I summarize those news that are the most important for you as developers inside the Kotlin ecosystem, be it for native Android, be it for Compose multi-platform, be it for Kotlin as a language. I've got you covered in this episode, so you don't need to always look these things up yourself. This time for December 2025, so that means I summarize those news from November 2025. And let's dive right into it. Here we have some Google Play console changes and actually some cool new features for those of you who have an app deployed in Google Play or plan to publish one there. Specifically, what I find interesting here is a simplified deep link validation with a built-in emulator. So this means here in your Google Play console, you now have this built-in emulator where you can enter a URL and therefore test deep links in your app, because deep links on Android can actually become quite tricky, since especially when you now want to deploy your app and publish it in Google Play. And by default, these normal HTTPS deep links won't work because you have to verify them. So you have to, in the end, verify that you own the domain from that deep link, and only then these deep links will be supported. It will be working in your app. And that is something you now don't have to test manually anymore after having released your app to production. But you can test this directly here inside the Google Play console by simply entering the URL, clicking test, and then Google Play or the console will show you the corresponding screen that would have opened from this URL. So that is something that I think is pretty cool. What I also think is pretty cool is this Gemini-powered localization. So this means even if you don't explicitly localize your app yourself now, then you can now let Gemini as an AI do that for you, and in the end generate multilingual projects and apps for your users. I don't know how well that works. I can imagine that there are some edge cases where you maybe have, let's say, an English company name that you don't want to be translated to other languages because that's simply a company name, and the AI would translate that. I think there are certain edge cases where the translation is not perfect, but I think this is definitely better than nothing, and something you can definitely now consider when using Google Play and their console. Next up is also a little piece of news here from Google themselves, which is about a new Android GitHub sample. So just like the other types of samples that Google already has released, so the Now an Android app and some others, this time it's, I think I pronounced this Cahier.
Cahier.
I think it's French. French people correct me. It's not Cahier, but I think it's Cahier. But I've dropped French in school, so I have no idea. But regardless, it is apparently notebook in French. So that's also not too important here. What is important and interesting to know is that it's in the end just a sample you can see for large screen productivity and creativity, because especially in the recent time, Google has made a lot of partly mandatory changes affecting the dimensions of your app. For example, you can't generally force portrait mode anymore, but only under certain conditions. They've released a lot of adaptive libraries and updates to those existing libraries in order to achieve supporting larger screens, lots of new material components. And because they probably saw that people are confused with all these new changes, they decided to release a sample app where you can learn how a typical responsive app with a large screen support would look like and could be implemented in code. And they also use some other cool APIs they have released, for example, the Ink API, something cool we can see down here. So on the one hand, you can see this is the support that they've added here, and if you resize this, then the app simply behaves as you would expect from a normal responsive app. And down here you actually have some very cool brushes they use in this app, which I think is pretty cool to find out if that is something you want to experiment with. This is also something, these notes, that is apparently implemented in the app and can be drawn like that with your finger. So in general, I can only highly recommend, if there are such repositories, especially from a source like Google, take a look at that. You can learn a lot from these repositories. You can actually find this repository also here on GitHub. Just search for the name. And then down here you find some information, also what it implements. You can see offline first, adaptive UI, material design, ink features, and so on. The overall technology stack. I would personally always take all these architectural recommendations and general recommendations from Google, at least with a grain of salt. Most of it, I would say, is really about solid recommendations. I've also recently made a video where I react to Google's guide to app architecture, where they outline their recommended principles, how you should structure your apps. I personally don't agree with everything, and in general, software architecture and all these best practices are often very opinionated. But if you're learning Android, then I can only recommend you to dive into such ready-made repositories, try to understand the code, maybe try to change it a little bit, add a feature, change a feature. This does require a little bit of discipline because it's not as easy as just clicking on a video, leaning back, and then probably struggling your own way in your own project afterwards. But you can also learn a lot from reading other people's code, because that is a very integral part of your daily work when really working as a developer. Next up, something so many, including me, have been waiting for. The Jetpack Navigation 3 library is now stable, at least for native Android. So in case you've missed this, Google in fact has released another navigation library. So there is on the one hand Compose Navigation, which is the normal navigation that you are maybe familiar with, at least if you have worked with navigation on Compose before. So the previous approach was the one that worked with nav hosts, with nested nav graphs, with composable blocks, with specific routes you define, with Kotlin serialization, with explicit deep linking support. All that is still existent. You can also use that. That is not deprecated. Nothing wrong with that. But now they've actually released another navigation library that actually fixes some of the issues that the previous approach has, or at least offers you a different way of thinking when developing a navigation setup for your app. Because with Navigation 3, you are actually the owner of your backstack, so you really have the backstack, so the entire stack of screens that are currently kind of visible in your app, or at least what the user has been on in the recent time. You're now the owner of that, so you really have that backstack as a data structure in your code. You could technically reverse that, you could shuffle it, you can simply pop single elements if you want, which gives you much more control over how your navigation should behave in your code. So it's overall just a different way of thinking when implementing navigation. But now that it's stable, I would say go try it, use it in your project. If you don't like it, it's completely fine to stick to the old approach. And if you like it, well then, good thing for you, because you now have a better way of doing it. Something I also like what Google has done for this Navigation 3 update of making it stable is this GitHub repository Nav3 recipes. That's in the end, a recipe is what they consider a single bit of information, or of a single kind of design pattern, we can say. So about a little piece of code, for example, how you achieve a certain thing with Navigation 3. For example, nesting nav graphs, or if we scroll down a little bit, how you implement a list detail screen, how you implement a bottom sheet with this new approach, how you work with a backstack. So for all these different use cases that you can also combine here, of course, for example, about animations, you can see a snippet here, animated activity, where it shows you how you would set that up in order to really achieve animated transitions here, in this case, nav display transition spec for your app. So if you're looking for a very specific thing to implement with Navigation 3, take a look at this Nav3 recipes repository, because chances are you're going to find it there. But before you ask, yes, of course, I will also make a tutorial about the main pain points developers have when migrating from the old approach to the new one. For example, deep linking is not so obvious anymore. Nesting navigation graphs is not so obvious anymore, and also scoping view models to a whole graph. That's possible, but it's not immediately intuitive if you have learned the old approach, how that would now translate and work in the new approach. Then we need to talk about a new Compose multi-platform version, because Compose multi-platform version 1.10.0, at least a new beta version of that, is out. And that actually brings some cool changes. Because on the one hand, a change that I've been looking forward to a lot is a unified preview annotation for our composables. Because in case you've developed for Compose multi-platform before, you will know this. For quite some time, there have been two different preview annotations. So on the one hand, the preview annotation for your composables, if you want to preview that in the IDE, that comes from Android X, so the actual Android Compose version kind of. And there was the JetBrains preview annotation, which was one being developed for Compose multi-platform specifically, but it was quite limited in functionality. So we could use that in order to preview composables, but there were just some parameters missing that we would be able to use with the normal preview annotation we know from native development, to preview different screen sizes, to change the theme, to change the background of the preview, to maybe preview in a specific device frame. And these two preview annotations with this new Compose multi-platform version have now been merged. So there's only the Android X preview, and you can use that and use all the same features for the preview in Compose that you also know from Android already. Then very important to mention, Navigation 3, which is now stable for native Android, is now also available for Compose multi-platform. So you can now use this, because for quite a while this library was an alpha for just Android, but now it is actually stable for Android and also available for Compose multi-platform. It's not entirely stable for Compose multi-platform. It is for the Android side, because obviously the Android side uses the same code that we also use in a native Android project with Nav3. But for other targets, iOS, desktop, and web, this Navigation 3 library for Compose multi-platform is in alpha now. Because in the end, there are some platform-specific differences between these platforms. So of course, navigating in a browser works a bit differently than on Android, because we have URLs, we maybe have a browser history, we may have multiple tabs of our same app. In iOS, we may have different system gestures. So to give you an example here, this is a specific end edge pan gesture behavior that we can use here in the iOS part of a Kotlin multi-platform project in order to have this back gesture behavior that native iOS users or just iOS users are partly familiar with. So this is the default behavior of Navigation 3 when navigating back. Here you can see just typical back gesture, but you can also implement it like this now in Navigation 3. On the one hand, swiping from the left to the right, but also from the right to the left, which may sometimes be a bit easier to reach if your thumb is on the right side of your phone. While it's not, in my opinion, very intuitive, that swiping from right to left would lead you to the previous page. But that's what iOS users are just often used to. And Navigation 3 implements this already with this end edge gesture behavior. Just as an example that there are some platform-specific differences here on when using navigation approaches. Another change that this new Compose multi-platform version brings is that hot reload. So the ability to develop Compose multi-platform applications for desktop and simply being able to refresh your program and its UI in real time the moment you make some sort of change in your Compose UI. That was previously also possible, but you needed a separate hot reload plugin applied to your Gradle file. And that is now baked into the Compose multi-platform plugin you're applying anyways in a Compose multi-platform project. So this extra hot reload plugin is simply not necessary anymore with this new version 1.10. And lastly, this new Compose multi-platform version can now also be used together with the latest, I think the latest Gradle version that is stable, 9.0.0. There is also for General Compose a new cool modifier that I think is worth highlighting here, which is modifier visible. This is a modifier that you can apply to any composable that will behave exactly like view.invisible. So if you come from the XML and view times of Android, you will know what this does. But it's in the end comparable to setting the alpha of your view to 0%. So it's pretty much invisible, but still occupies the same space that it would normally occupy. And there are certain scenarios where this is definitely useful, because if you don't do this and you simply wrap your view in a normal if condition with an isVisible boolean, if that condition is false and the view is not visible, or the composable rather, then it won't occupy the space. So it could be that when a view disappears, when a composable disappears, that your UI actually jumps a little bit because the size of your existing UI tree changes. And if you don't want that, you can now use this new modifier visible. I'm not entirely sure if this is a commit that is already in the latest version of Compose. You can see it's submitted here November 19th, which is roughly a week ago. But it's something you can definitely see in the Compose version very soon. Also, another change in the new Compose Material 3 version 1.4.0 that is very important to share. If you've been using Compose, then you've probably also used the Compose Material Icons dependency before. So in the end, what gave you these icons.outline.exit icon, where you can just reference an icon directly in code and assign that to some kind of image or icon composable. That was always very convenient, but it's not recommended anymore, and this dependency also won't be included by default in Compose project anymore. You can still implement this and add this dependency if you really want. It just won't get any more updates, and Google discourages you from using it because on the one hand, it has increased the build times of your project by quite a lot, because you must imagine that this dependency brings a lot of different icons and the code that is needed for all of these, while you probably only need a set of 5, maybe 10 or 20 different icons. Instead, Google wants you to use the Android Studio vector asset dialog. So going to your drawable, right-clicking, add new vector asset, and then you have a catalog of all the supported icons from Google directly. They call it material symbols now, so the icons have also slightly changed. Then you simply import that as an XML file in your drawable folder, and then from there you can reference it in your Compose code. It's a bit more of a headache for developers, but I also see the reason in saying, okay, that previous dependency has increased build times. which is honestly also a headache for developers. So we just have to decide between a headache and a headache here. Welcome to Android development. Then a little news, or at least a little tool that I think is very worth sharing, also from someone who regularly releases very cool, mostly I think written content on his blog. I won't try to pronounce his name, but it's Skydovs, also quite known in the Android community, but is in the end a Compose stability analyzer. That is very worth highlighting here. So if you're a bit into Compose, then you know that there are different types of fields in Compose. So we have these stable types, we have unstable types, and depending on what your type is, if it's unstable, then there's just the risk that your code goes through more recompositions than it would have to do. And this tool in the end analyzes your Compose code in order to tell you directly which specific Compose parameters are stable and where you may have an unstable parameter. So here, this is, for example, how this looks like. This is from my Chirp repository, the chat app in Compose multi-platform built in my Kotlin full stack developer bundle. You'll find the link below. But in the end, if you now have a composable function, you get these little squares here after having installed the corresponding plugin, which is this Compose stability analyzer. Just install this, and then you also have these features. And here, for example, tells us, okay, that parameter is stable, that lambda is also stable. This view model here is unstable, because in this case, it has one mutable var property, and that is a scenario where a parameter in Kotlin or in Compose would be considered unstable. It's important to really understand what this means, and that you don't generally say, oh my god, unstable parameter, I need to change my code, because it's really not that bad. Because here, for example, this view model being unstable is expected. Of course, view models have certain mutable properties. It would not be a problem because this is in the end a root screen composable. It does not really contain any parameters here that would change throughout the lifetime of a specific screen. So in this case, having selected a specific chat won't change for the lifetime of the screen. The logout lambda will also not change. We'll always do the same thing there. So this composable won't really recompose anyways. And then we also don't need to care about unstable parameters. And in general, also, if you have an unstable parameter, that does not automatically mean it's a critical problem in your code. It just means it could be a reason that your composable is recomposing more often than it needs to. But in general, that also falls under the concept of premature optimization. Avoid that. But if you have performance problems in your Compose code, then it's a very good idea to take a look at stable and unstable parameters. And this plugin helps you to find these issues, or at least spot little improvements of your Compose code in regards to performance more easily. So big shout out to Skydovs here. I really love your content. And last piece of news here that is very interesting. That is a new tool, a new IDE from Google. Maybe you've already heard about this, Google Antigravity, which has a very fancy landing page here. In short, this is just a new IDE from Google, which has fully focused on AI agents. So you can see evolving the IDE into the agent-first era. Okay. It is heavily based on the interface of VS Code. You can see this is in the end VS Code with some extra features that put a lot of focus on these AI agents. It, for example, has an inbuilt browser in order to really use these AI agents to build your website and then automatically be able to also verify what it has done. Load the website in the browser in order to check, okay, does that look as expected? Do I need to change something? So in the end, you can just have one or multiple agents telling them specific tasks about how to develop your software, and then leaving the rest up to them while documenting what they are doing. That is, in very short, in a nutshell, what this new IDE allows us to do. While I have not tried this out, it sounds a lot that this is mainly targeting web developers. We can also see some JavaScript code or TypeScript actually. While an AI will, of course, also be able to write and change some Android or Kotlin code, this whole IDE does not really seem to be developed for the use of mobile development. If you would want to use AI agents for mobile development, then my feeling would tell me to rather rely on the agents we already have inside the mobile main IDE, so Android Studio, for Kotlin at least. Because we do have the Gemini agent there, we do have Junie from JetBrains there, we do have Claude Code technically there. All those are AI agents that we can already use for our mobile development purposes. But in case you have used Antigravity before for an Android project, let us know below how well that has worked for you. But all in all, use these AI features, become familiar with them. It will really be a requirement in future for a developer if you want to survive on the job market, to be able to confidently use all these different AI tools, AI agents. in order to become a more productive developer. They won't replace you anytime soon. AI has in fact hit quite a plateau for quite a while, has not really improved, has not really gotten that much better for development. Use it to learn faster, use it to develop faster, but still understand what you are doing. The biggest risk of using AI tools is when people don't understand what they are doing. That is what we then call vibe coding. That is cool as long as you go through the happy path, so the ideal path a user would go through in order to get what they expect from the software. But especially when it is about security critical infrastructure, you don't want to depend too much on what an AI tells you. You want to understand it yourself, and you still want to be able to develop software on your own. And especially when getting deeper into a technology and understanding all those more internal concepts, that is where AIs are just super bad at right now and have no idea what they're actually doing. So knowing that and really understanding that gives you such a fundamental understanding of the framework and technology you really work with on a daily basis. And that is something that is necessary in order to know what an AI tells you. So you don't get around learning coding. In fact, you even have to learn more coding and more internal concepts in order to assess how good the output of an AI is when it tells you something. And if you're in that position to confidently assess that, you will have a great future as a developer. That is my opinion. If you want us to help you get that internal knowledge and really deeply understanding the technologies you work with, then maybe our mentorship program is something for you, where you really train from whatever level you are at as a mobile developer, be it Android or Kotlin multi-platform, to someone who can really confidently use the most important technologies as a mobile developer and also really understand these and be able to use these in a scaling product. I'll include a link to this mentorship program down below. It's application only, but if that sounds good to you, apply, and maybe that's a fit. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you back in the next video. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye-bye.